Hi everyone, it's great to be with you and great to be able to share with you today. We, in this series, have been thinking about the things that people really want and trying to think about those things from a Christian perspective. And my aim with that is really just to, if you're someone who isn't a Christian, just to, by exploring each of these topics, to show why I think it's worth exploring Christianity, why Christianity is really worth considering. So I have a fairly modest aim. I'm not trying to just convince you that it's true or that you have to become a Christian today, but just that it might be worth taking seriously and investigating and finding out more. If you are a Christian already, then the aim really is to, provide a way of showing how you could explore these important topics with your friends, how you might talk about them, what the issues really are, and what might be some good ways forward in talking to others. So that's what we're trying to do. In the series last week we talked about the big question of meaning and purpose in life. This week we're just focusing down a bit more on the particular issue of pleasure. And then next week we'll be talking about potential and how a person can reach their potential. So we're doing the talks 3 times each week, Monday nights, then Tuesday and Wednesday at 1. So there's several opportunities also to bring along friends during that time. So today we're thinking about pleasure, and I think it's fair to say that for many people this is the guiding principle of their lives. It's the essential way of thinking about how life should be lived, about how to make decisions, about what's right and wrong for you, how to plan your life, these kinds of things. What many people have called a pleasure-pain ethic. A pleasure-pain ethic. And here really the simple idea is to, as far as possible, minimise pain in your life and maximise the pleasure in your life. This ethic has the advantage of being simple and readily understandable, and so it's attractive to lots of people for that reason, and that we all understand that pleasure is good and that pain is evil, I think, and so it just connects with something that is very immediate in our experience. Thinking about things in this way is of course not new. Human beings have for a long time thought in terms of pleasure and pain, but it's fair to say that it hasn't been the primary way of thinking about life for people in most places at most times. So it's just worth saying this is in some ways a new thing, that it has become the primary thing. But we know of ancient thinkers, both in the East and in the West, who thought about the issues of pleasure and pain and how significant they were to living a good life. But really, perhaps the most important figure in thinking about this issue is a guy called Jeremy Bentham. And he was the originator of a movement called utilitarianism. And what he was doing was searching for a way of thinking about morality and ethics that was objective, that people from different worldviews and different religions and different ideas could share in together a kind of, if you like, secular way of thinking about what's right and what's wrong. And he was really concerned with, how could we agree on making legislation? How could we agree on making laws that everyone could agree to? And this is what he was grasping towards with his thinking. And here is a quotation from his book about the principles of morals and legislation, 1780, which summarises a lot of his thinking. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. So he sees all of human beings, all humanity, under the rule of pleasure and pain, and that all of our thinking should be governed by questions about pleasure and pain. And you may know that his sort of rule was that we should make decisions which make for the greatest good or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Greatest good for the greatest number. And people have found that idea, when they encounter it, initially pretty attractive. It's understandable, and it sounds like it makes good sense, And so, well, let's try and build a society on that kind of thinking. But actually, in practice, utilitarianism hasn't become universal and people's main way of thinking about those kinds of issues in the objective sense, in terms of the way that government policy is made and that kind of thing. There are all kinds of problems actually in implementing a utilitarian view. For example, how do you measure pleasure and pain, and how do you measure them against each other, and how do you measure one person's pleasure against another person's pleasure, and so on. There are all kinds of issues about sort of quantifying things. As well as that, there was the issue about, well, what is really good? What is, if we're going to say the maximum good, then what actually is good? It's sort of left up in the air, the issue of what is good, and just returned us to all the issues of philosophy that he was trying to get past in the first place. But if utilitarianism hasn't kind of become the universal objective way of people thinking about these issues, has succeeded in becoming the personal way that people think about these issues. That in a very individualistic society, we've perhaps given up on saying, okay, how can I bring the greatest good to the greatest number? But we have very much embraced the idea that making decisions should be about maximising my personal pleasure and minimising my personal pain. That people grabbed onto that and said, that I can understand and that makes sense for my life, and that's the way I'm going to think about things and pursue it. So maybe Bentham's ideas have been rejected, but pleasure and pain has been embraced as the main thing. And I think that this has strong connections with, for example, Sigmund Freud's way of thinking about, well, what do human beings really want? They just, at its heart, it's about minimising your pain, maximising your pleasure. And that has carried the day in the modern world in terms of the way people think about things. So for many people, especially from a Western background, the issues tended to traditionally be about right and wrong, about what was lawful and unlawful, and to make decisions on that basis. Perhaps people from more traditional societies in the East the issues have tended to be about honour and shame, and what kind of decisions would bring honour to me and my family, what kind of things would bring dishonour and shame. And that was the primary way of thinking about things. But now, everyone together in the modern world, increasingly thinking in terms of pleasure and pain. And so when a moral issue comes up, like, should we have euthanasia, should we have assisted suicide, the primary way of sorting through that question has become, well, how can we minimise people's pain, maximise their pleasure? Well, as we think about this, I want to say that that has a lot going for it. It really does have a lot going for it. That we notice, first of all, that human beings really are made for pleasure. That we're able to experience pleasure in incredibly sophisticated ways. A great variety of ways. We're able to refine our experience of our senses and think about it really deeply and experience pleasure very deeply. And the Bible actually says we were made that way by God, and it's not an accident that we seek out pleasure and that we want it. And also, the Bible will affirm equally that pain is bad, that pain is evil, and that we're quite right to desire to live in a world without pain. The pleasure and pain ethic makes sense. It's common sense. And the Bible will particularly talk about simple pleasures as something commendable. In a world that is full of grief, in a world that's full of pain, if you can find pleasure in simple things, you can find pleasure in the simple things where you don't have to exploit other people or hurt other people in order to enjoy the simple things. If you can avoid pain and enjoy the work that you have to do in your life, then that's good. That's commendable. And so the book of Ecclesiastes talks about this. The person who speaks in the book, called the teacher, a king reflecting on his own experience, talks about what he's discovered about pleasure in this regard. And so, for example, I've printed there for you chapter 2, verse 24. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. If you can enjoy your work, that's brilliant. If you can find enjoyment in eating and drinking, that's great as well. Let me read to you some similar quotes from the book. Chapter 3, verse 22. I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. Chapter 8, verse 15. I commend the enjoyment of life, because there's nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of their life God has given them under the sun. It's good to be able to enjoy your life and to enjoy the simple things. Or chapter 9, verse 9. Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love, all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. All your meaningless days. Well, that's right. Life is full of futility. It is often experienced as meaningless. And so the teacher says, well, enjoy what you can. Enjoy relationship with a spouse. Enjoy the pleasure that comes from that. Enjoy eating and drinking. And if you can enjoy your work, well, how fantastic is that? And so I think there's encouragement to say, well, pleasure and pain, that's not stupid. That makes sense. That's not a bad way to live your life. However, and look, I want to say, I think, if that is your worldview, if you really are just thinking in terms of, I want to maximise my pleasure, minimise my pain, I think Christianity is the way to go, just from that point of view. I don't think the pleasure-pain thing is the right way to think about life ultimately, but if that is your way of thinking about life, I still think Christianity is the way to go, and I'll explain a bit about why that is at the end. But I do want to point out some of the limits of the pleasure-pain approach. Let me just mention a few of them briefly. First of all, there is the problem of being a student. And this might sound kind of surprising, but I think you already know that this approach is not all there is to be said about life, right? You don't think it's just about finding pleasure and avoiding pain. And the reason I know that is because you're Melbourne University students. And you have deliberately chosen pain. Many of you have experienced great pain in order just to get here, and you continue to do things that you do not enjoy in order to achieve other things. And it's not just that you think a bit of pain now means more pleasure later. That could be your attitude, but I think many of you have goals that are more than just that in the future you might enjoy more pleasure, the pleasure of your senses, by getting rich or something like that. That might be what you're thinking in terms of uni. But people have bigger goals than that and higher aims. And so I think many of you know instinctively that thinking just in terms of pleasure and pain is not enough. And in fact, that there may be more important things in life than that. Second thing to say about it, I think, is that the pleasure-pain view is an infantile view of life. It's a childish view. And interestingly, Aristotle, in his Ethics, said that pleasure and pain is a great starting point for thinking ethically. And why is it a great starting point? Because children can get it. Children get pleasure and pain. They understand that actions have their consequences, and some bring pain, some bring pleasure. And so you can teach a child an ethical worldview by beginning with pleasure and pain. But he thought that you had to move on beyond that as you grew up. Otherwise, you just would stay a child. And he in fact thought that to become really wise, you would just focus on minimising pain. That was real wisdom. Chasing after pleasure could only lead to trouble, in Aristotle's view. And so as you grew up, you would put aside the pleasure thing, and you would just choose to try to minimise the pain in your life. Now, I think that was wrong, but it's just interesting that here was a thinker who didn't think that the pleasure-pain thing worked for people once they grew up. It's actually a babyish way to live, just considering your immediate level of pleasure or pain. I mentioned to you, I think before, David Foster Wallace and his essay that he wrote, or an article that he wrote called "A Supposedly Fun Thing That I'll Never Do Again." And he got sent on a pleasure cruise, a 5-star luxury liner, by a magazine with instructions just to write about it. So they said, here, you can go on this cruise for free. All you have to do is write an article for us about your experience. And he wrote about it. And his take on the whole experience was that what they did on the luxury liner was anything they could do, the staff would do anything they could to make sure you were comfortable, that there was no problem in your life at all, that everything was taken care of for you, and that you were experiencing as much constant pleasure as you could. And he said the language that they use on the luxury liner all the time is that they want to pamper you. They want to pamper you. And he said this is no coincidence. You may know that in America, Pampers is like the #1 brand of disposable nappies. He's saying they are treating you like a baby, and you are enjoying a perfectly infantile experience of being totally protected from the world, like a good parent would protect you, and given everything that you need without effort. It's an experience of being, and he found it miserable. He found it a supposedly fun thing that I'll never do again. It's childish, and it's actually something that needs to be grown out of. Another thing about pleasure and the pleasure-pain ethic is that pleasures are problematic in themselves, and one of the reasons for this is that they cloy. It's not a word that we use very often. Try it out sometime. It's a great word. Try it out on your friends. Something that you like to do together, and you don't like it anymore, and you say, "I found 10-pin bowling is now cloying," or something like that. I don't know. You don't have to try it out. Cloying is when the thing that you enjoyed, you no longer find sweet anymore. It sickens you rather than pleases you. And so many pleasures are like this, or they just come to, in the end, bore us. The thing that we loved before, we actually sadly get used to, and then we don't like it so much anymore. That actually the search for pleasure then means searching for novelty. We continue to need new kinds of pleasure and stimulation. Or the pleasure is passing. That is, it's a good thing and you really like it, but it doesn't satisfy. That once you've experienced the pleasure, actually you find yourself again needing it just as much as before, or wanting it just as much as before. That is, it hasn't satisfied you. This is true of eating meals. Obviously, you eat a great meal, fantastic. The next day, hungry again. It's as if you'd never eaten. This is as if that pleasure had never happened. This is famously true of sexual pleasure as well. Our appetites are actually not able to be satisfied. One day I was up on the south coast of New South Wales during winter. Went up there during the winter holidays. I was walking along the beach. In New South Wales in winter, it's lovely. Not like here, right? And you have days that are just beautiful, they're like summer days in winter. So we were walking along the beach. The sun was out. It's a beautiful day. There was a lovely light breeze. I was walking along the beach with family and friends. It was just gorgeous. It was just perfect. I thought it was perfect. But then dolphins appeared in the water. Yes. And so it was just one of those glorious, what could it be any better? It's just wonderful. But then the dolphins went away. The sun went down behind a cloud. The cool breeze came up. Everyone was shivering. And the moment was gone. It just lasted, half an hour. And then it was over. And so much of our experience of pleasure is like that. That we find it hard to find pleasure that satisfies and that lasts and we don't get tired of. We have a problem with pleasure. And I think that there is an answer to that. But the answer that people tend to go for in the pleasure-pain ethic is just more. It's just trying to keep the party going. It's just trying to make everything happen and be as good as it can so that I just get a constant experience of pleasure in my life. And actually, one of the things that happens there is that we lose mastery. We actually lose control because we've become enslaved to the need for pleasure at that point. So people think that they're in control, they're individually choosing what's pleasurable, avoiding pain, but unwittingly have become slaves in the pursuit of pleasure. Another issue in the pleasure thing is the problem of perfect pleasure. And here, this is just thinking about what would happen in this world if we were able to achieve the goal of this ethic. That is, we were able to avoid all pain and experience constant pleasure. And this issue was raised for me by an atheist guy, a really well thought out atheist here on Melbourne Uni campus. He was telling me about how, he had this philosophy, this utilitarian philosophy of trying to maximise pleasure and minimise pain. And he said, well, but we've realised there is a problem. What are we actually saying the goal is here? What would it look like to achieve this goal? And he talked about, well, what it would look like would be something like this. First of all, we'd need to isolate people from the rest of the world. Because the world is full of pain and the world is full of grief, we'd need to kind of cocoon people, separate them off from the world to protect them from pain. So it would be a vision of people being separated somehow and having some kind of protective layer around them. And then, in order for them to experience perfect pleasure, we would need to create some kind of way of delivering constant pleasure to them. And maybe by stimulating their senses in some way, but probably by directly acting on their brain. And if somehow we could stimulate people's brains in a careful, precise way, we could give them the experience of perfect pleasure all the time. So imagine this person, they're cocooned away, they're in some kind of shell, and they're just experiencing constant pleasure. Is this an attractive view of the future? Well, maybe, but it sounds like it could be a description of hell, just about. It's not clear that actually this would be a good thing for us. And I think I know why, but it's just worth saying that was a problem for this particularly well thought out atheist thinking about this question. Well, I think to understand why that is not a glorious vision of the future, we need to just go back to what we talked about last week and the meaning of life. What life is actually meant to be about. And last week I made the case that from the Bible's point of view and from Jesus' teaching, we can see that it's in fact relationships that are meant to be at the centre of our lives. That we're made as relational beings in order to enjoy relationships with God and with other people, and that we're meant to also have a particular relationship to the world, the rest of the created world. We are meant to be people who rule and care for that world. That we have a big purpose in our lives to experience those relationships of love and service, and to experience that rule, that serving rule of the world. That's what our lives are meant to be about. And if that is true, then that actually gives us a different view of pleasure. If pleasure is our primary purpose, then relationships are necessarily secondary, and they become a matter of utility in the utilitarian view. That is, we think about the relationship in terms of what can it do for me? What can this person do for me in terms of maximising my pleasure, minimising my pain? Can this person hurt me? Can this person help me? Can this person give me pleasure? Can this person spare me from pain? That becomes our way of thinking. It's not really about them. It's not about relating to them or knowing them or being known by them. It's about their utility. And we can see, I think, as we look around the world, lots of people treat others in that way, according to their utility. And if people cease to be useful, then they can be discarded. But the relational view actually makes pleasure not the primary thing, but a kind of byproduct in some ways. That when relationships work well, there is pleasure. Or actually, the thing I want to talk about is that there is joy. And here I just want to distinguish between pleasure and joy. In the Bible, and I think in the way we talk, these two things overlap and they're often connected in various ways. But by pleasure, I just mean the enjoyment that we get from the stimulation of our senses. But by joy, I mean the enjoyment that we get that comes from relationship. And let me just try and illustrate the difference. So imagine you're watching a YouTube video, and in the video there is it's a video of a kitten. This never happens in real life. No, it's a kitten. It's yet another kitten one, right? And it's a kitten learning to walk. It's a very little baby kitten. It's walking for the first time. It's wobbling all over the place. Doesn't know what it's doing. And you're laughing at it. It's very funny. It's amusing. It's cute. You like it. It's a delight to your eyes, and you like what you see, right? Okay, that's fun. That's good. That's pleasurable. But imagine now in the video, it's a baby. It's a baby learning to walk. And you watch it and it wobbles in the same way as the kitten, but you have a slightly different feeling about it. Okay, now imagine it's not a video. It's real life, and there is a baby learning to walk, walking towards you. And imagine it's your baby. It's your child. And you see them take their first steps, and they look up and they realise what they're doing, and they smile at you and they walk towards you. How do you feel about that? Well, I just want to suggest to you that is not just pleasure. It's not the same kind of pleasure as the kitten video. It's joy. And it's joy that comes from the relationship. I'm very happy that babies all over the world are learning to walk, but when my own child does that is a feeling of pleasure which is deeper in a way than just that my senses are experiencing something good. That's joy. And joy comes from relationship. It's often, I think, to do with seeing others flourish that we care for and being able to help them to flourish in their life. And so I think pleasure is good, but from the biblical point of view, joy is even better. Joy is even better. It's putting relationships at the centre of our lives, but acknowledging that, yes, we are made for enjoyment, we are made for pleasure, but that at its best is always related to our relationships. So eating a beautiful meal is great, but eating a beautiful meal on your own is a different experience from eating it with friends. You may know the definition of tragedy, which goes, tragedy is hitting a hole in one when you're playing golf on your own. That even the pleasures of this life are best shared, and that actually it's the relationships which are the crucial thing, not so much the pleasure itself. Let me refer to that great philosophical work, the Pixar movie WALL-E. You know WALL-E? And I want you to think about, if you know the movie, think about the situation of humanity in the movie. So in the story, human beings have fled from the planet. They have given up on planet Earth, and they're living on a spacecraft that looks very much like an ocean liner. And they're living lives of pleasure up there, having abandoned the Earth. Every need is taken care of by robots. They cruise around on these sort of reclining beds. They have a screen in front of them all the time that they watch, and they're constantly sucking on these giant sodas, and the weather is always perfect, and so they live these lives of pleasure without pain until Wally and Eve arrive to upset the situation. And they literally upset the situation. And you remember, one of the things that happens at this point is that the spaceship tilts at one point, and they all kind of slide into each other, and at some point a man and a woman accidentally touch hands. All right, and they look at each other and they go, oh. They rediscover relationship at that point. And they realise that they have been pampered and that they are like giant babies. And they actually look like, I think this is they look like giant babies because that's what they are. And they rediscover relationship, and then they rediscover their responsibility for the world as well. They return to the earth, spoilers, and set about taking responsibility for the world. So there are people rediscovering their purpose. They had pleasure, but then they find something better. They discover joy in relationship. And from the Bible's point of view, joy in relationship with other human beings is great, but even better than that, even more significant, is pleasure in relationship with God. That this is meant to be our basic relationship around which everything else fits, and that is meant to be a relationship where we do experience pleasure and joy. So let me just read to you some words by King David, and he wrote a song here, song number 16 it's called. We probably could come up with a better title for it. And it reflects on what it's like to be in a relationship with God. David was a very spiritual person. He knew what this was like, and this is what he wrote about it. I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one see decay. You make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. David knows what it's like to be in relationship with God. He knows that God will be with him and rescue him, even from death, that he won't be abandoned to the realm of the dead, and that he'll be able to be with God forever, and that will be an experience of joy and eternal pleasure. That is, he looks forward to a time, because of relationship with God, where the pleasure won't run out, where the pleasure won't be passing, where actually it will keep going, it will last, because he will be with the person who created pleasure in the beginning. He'll be with the one who brings joy into our lives. And so this is the hope that David had. This is what he understood was the direction of relationship with God. That being in relationship with God wasn't going to make him miserable. It was actually going to be enjoyable. And it was going to be enjoyable now, but it was also going to lead to eternal joy. And I think if you have that kind of perspective, it means that you can live a life now where you don't have to experience constant joy or constant pleasure. We're actually able to face and embrace the pain of life sometimes because you love others, because you're committed to a relationship. And actually being in relationship will sometimes mean pain, because it means serving others at your own cost. And this is particularly the perspective that Jesus leads us to. Jesus was committed to relationship with us. He was willing to endure pain for our sake, so that we could know God, so that we could belong to God, so that we could experience that eternal joy with God. And so pleasure and pain isn't all that there is. It's not the only way of making decisions. But if we know that we have a future of eternal joy, then we can face pain now, and deliberately sometimes choose pain now for the sake of others, because relationship is more important. I'm going to pray, and if you'd like to ask a question, you can do that. Let's pray. Lord God and Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that you are the author and originator of pleasure. We thank you for the opportunity to know you because of Jesus, and for the possibility of experiencing joy that lasts forever. And we want to pray that everyone here might experience that joy. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. There's a few minutes for questions. Would anyone like to ask anything?
Yeah, so it seems like this future of eternal pleasure. How the difference is that you're like trying to pursue like constant pleasure on earth here and like getting sick and stuff?
Yeah. I think that the pleasure that is just the pleasure of the senses, I think, is the thing that people aim for, and where they experience that disappointment of it cloys or it passes or whatever. And but the pleasure we're talking about here is of a relationship but it's a particular relationship that is with an eternal, limitless God, who we will never tire of getting to know better or experiencing the presence of. So I think that's the difference, that we as finite creatures are constantly experiencing finite pleasures. We find it hard to imagine what an infinite being who can give us infinite pleasure might be like. Yeah, so I think that's the difference. So I think the dream of unending pleasure is not wrong. Yeah, it's just that the way we try to satisfy that is often inadequate. Yeah.
Doesn't the pleasure pain narrative kind of require, like a rich man's narrative, that you already need to have basic things to actually think about pleasure? Like the ability to choose to avoid pain is actually, like, how can a slave do that? How can someone in a developing country?
Yeah. So it maybe it's a particular ethic of people who are very, very much free and maybe experiencing affluence. Yeah, and it wouldn't work so well elsewhere. Yeah, that could be right.
This is probably more a question about perspective and it's not ten-dimensional, but in some ways it seems that the currency of success and achievement is pain. So do you think that the dominance of the pleasure-pain world has caused society to be more lazy and more irresponsive in your... Because do you think it's kind of emerged and more dominantly like...
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's just hard to know because, yeah, that's right. People are sacrificing in all kinds of ways all the time. So there are other things going on besides just the way people think they think about things. Yeah. And pleasure pain is not the only thing, not the only way that people think about life. But it could be that a society that's maybe reaching a decadent stage, that may be one of the marks of it. And we know that, in history, societies don't just keep getting stronger and stronger. Sometimes they enter a decadent phase and where people become obsessed with pleasure and they neglect the other things that hold the society together. Yeah, that's speculating. I'm not sure. Yeah. All right, thank you. Next week we'll talk about reaching your potential.